The morning light came in thin and pale over the Redstone Creek Valley, the kind of October light that had no warmth left in it, that fell across the land like a reminder of what was coming. Winter, always winter eventually. Clara Ashford had been up since before that light appeared. She was already at the eastern fence line when the sun cleared the ridge, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands wrapped around a post driver that was heavier than most men at the Ashford Ranch would have bothered lifting. Old Silas worked beside her without speaking. That was one of the things Clara had always appreciated about the old man. He did not fill silence with noise just because silence made other people uncomfortable. He drove posts and she stretched wire, and between them they fixed what needed fixing, which was how most mornings began on the Ashford property, at least for Clara. She was 22 years old and had spent more mornings like this one than she could count. Out here before the household woke, out here with the animals and the fence lines and the particular quiet of a working ranch before people complicated it. Her boots were worn through at the left heel. Her costume was her father's old one 3 sizes too large, the collar turned up against the cold. Her dark hair was braided back practical and plain, and there was a smear of dried mud along her left forearm that she had not bothered to clean because there was more mud coming and there was no point. Inside the main house, her older sister Constance was still asleep. Constance, who was 19 and already engaged to the son of the First National Bank of Cheyenne. Constance, who had soft hands and dressed for dinner every evening like the dining room was a stage, and she was performing a role she had rehearsed since childhood. Constance, who their mother Meredith looked at with something that might have been pride or might have just been satisfaction at seeing her own careful plans taking shape. And then there was Nell, 17 and quiet in a way that Clara had never been able to determine was peace or surrender. Nell read books and smiled at appropriate moments and never said anything that caused trouble, which in the Ashford household passed for virtue. Clara drove another post into the frozen ground and did not think about her sisters. She thought about the south pasture fence, which also needed work. She thought about the 3 head of cattle that had gotten through a gap 2 days ago and had to be rounded up from the neighboring picket property, which had not improved Harlan Ashford's standing with his neighbor. She thought about practical things because practical things were the only things she was permitted to be good at in this family, and she had decided long ago to be excellent at them. The bell rang from the main house at 8:30. Not the meal bell, the summons bell. The one Meredith Ashford rang when she wanted the household assembled without delay and without excuses. Old Silas looked up from the wire he was twisting. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. "Better go," he said. "Better," she agreed. She pulled off her work gloves and tucked them into her coat pocket and walked back toward the house across the frozen ground, her boots crunching through the thin rime of frost that had settled overnight. The main house of the Ashford property was a substantial building, white-painted timber, with a wraparound porch that Meredith had insisted on because it looked like the houses in the magazines she ordered from back east. It looked fine from a distance. Up close, you could see where the paint was beginning to peel on the north side and where 3 of the porch boards needed replacing. Clara noticed these things. Harlan Ashford pretended not to. She came through the side door into the kitchen, pulled off her boots, and walked into the main sitting room in her stockinged feet because she had learned years ago that her mother's fury at dirty boots on the parlor rug was a more exhausting consequence than the small indignity of sock feet. They were all there. Constance was arranged on the settee with the particular posture she had practiced until it looked natural, one that communicated ease and refinement simultaneously. She was wearing the blue dress, the good one, and her hair was already done. Nell stood near the window. her arms folded across herself in that self-contained way she had, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Meredith sat straight-backed in the wingback chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calibrated to reveal nothing. And Harlan Ashford stood in the center of the room holding an envelope. Clara had seen her father hold letters before. She had seen him hold letters that contained good news, and letters that contained bad news, and letters that contained the kind of complicated news that he would spend 3 days pretending was good before admitting it was bad. She had learned to read him the way you learn to read weather out here. The set of his jaw, the particular tension around his eyes. This was something else. This was something she had not seen before. He looked like a man who had been handed something he had not expected and was still calculating what to do with it. "Close the door," he said to Clara without looking at her. She closed it. "Sit down." "I'll stand." His eyes moved to her then. The mud on her arm, the work coat, the braided hair. She watched him decide not to say anything about any of it, which told her the letter was more important than his usual objections. "I've received a proposal," he said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Constance straightened slightly, which she would not have thought possible given how straight she already sat. Meredith's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. Nell looked at the floor. "A proposal," Meredith said. The word in her mouth was careful, controlled, but Clara could hear the shape of the hope underneath it. "From Ethan Croft." Harlan let the name sit for a moment. He knew the effect it would have. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Of Storm Ridge. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. The kind that meant everyone in the room was rearranging something in their heads. Ethan Croft, the name had the weight of legend attached to it the way some names did out here in Wyoming Territory in 1882. He owned Storm Ridge, which meant he owned the better part of 3,000 acres of prime grazing land on the northern range, plus water rights that made him more powerful than most of the valley ranchers combined, plus timber holdings that generated income enough to weather any number of bad cattle years. He was somewhere in his late 30s, never married, despite being the most eligible man in 4 counties, and ran his operation like a kingdom unto itself, largely separate from the social machinations of the valley towns. People told stories about Ethan Croft, about how he had rebuilt Storm Ridge from near ruin after his father died and left him with debts and a workforce on the edge of walking. About how he had refused 3 separate offers to sell his water rights to the railroad for enough money to live comfortably in the East for the rest of his life because he would not let the railroad control the valley's water. About how he paid his workers wages that other ranch owners considered dangerous to their own arrangements, and how those workers stayed year after year and built something that looked more like a community than an operation. He was, in short, the kind of man that a family like the Ashfords would consider far beyond their reach. The Ashfords were respectable. They were landed. They had the trappings of prosperity and the social position that came from maintaining those trappings carefully. But they were not Ethan Croft, not in any category that mattered. "A proposal," Constance said softly. Her voice was measured, but Clara could hear the excitement moving underneath it like water under ice. "For me." "He's asking for one of my daughters," Harlan said. "He's been specific." He looked down at the letter in his hands. "He's asking for Clara." The room went very quiet, not the ordinary quiet, the specific quiet that happens when something so unexpected occurs that the people present need a moment to determine how to respond to it. Clara felt it like a physical sensation, the weight of that silence pressing against her from all sides. And then Meredith laughed. It was not a kind sound. It was high and sharp and involuntary. The laugh of a woman confronted with something so absurd that her composure slipped for just a moment before she caught it and pressed it back into place. She covered her mouth with her hand, but the laugh had already happened. It was already in the room with all of them. Clara, Meredith said. Clara, Harlan confirmed. He was reading from the letter, now his voice taking on the businesslike tone he used for contracts and negotiations. Mr. Croft writes that he has been aware of our family for some time and has made his choice with deliberate consideration. He specifically requests Clara's hand in marriage and is prepared to offer a substantial bride price in acknowledgement of the arrangement. How substantial, Meredith said. Harlan named a figure. Constance made a small sound. Nell looked up from the floor for the first time. Even Meredith, who had been holding herself with perfect composure, blinked. The number was considerable, more than considerable. It was the kind of number that could clear the debts Harlan Ashford had been quietly accumulating over 3 years of bad investments and worse luck. The debts that Clara was fairly certain only she and the family accountant knew the full scope of because Harlan's pride prevented him from acknowledging financial difficulty even to his own wife. It was 3 times what Constance's engagement had yielded, and Constance's match had been considered a triumph. That's, Constance said slowly, a significant offer. It is, Harlan said. He folded the letter and his hands were steady. Clara watched his face. She watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid arithmetic of a man who had been looking for a solution to a problem and had just been handed one in a form he had not anticipated. When would the arrangement need to be confirmed? Meredith asked. He wants the marriage completed before the first heavy snow, Harlan said. His men would come to escort Clara to Storm Ridge within the fortnight, the ceremony to take place upon arrival. Clara had not spoken since she came into the room. She had stood near the door in her stockinged feet and her work coat with the mud on her arm, and she had listened to her family discuss her the way they might discuss the sale of a piece of property, with interest, with calculation, with the kind of careful attention that had never been directed at her in any other context. I would like to say something, Clara said. Clara! Her father's voice carried the warning he did not bother to put into words. Do I have a say in this? Harlan looked at her then, really looked at her in the way he did when he was determining whether an obstacle was worth the energy of going around or could simply be pushed through. This is an extraordinary opportunity for this family, he said. Ethan Croft is not a man who makes proposals twice. If we decline, the opportunity does not come again. I understand that. I'm asking if I have a say. You're being dramatic, Meredith said. Am I? Clara. Constance's voice was gentle, the gentleness of a person trying to smooth something over. Arrangements like this are how things work. Father and mother were arranged. My engagement to William was arranged through our families. This is no different. It is different, Clara said. I've never met this man. None of us have. He has a reputation, but a reputation is not a person. And I am a person. You are an Ashford daughter, Meredith said, her voice sharpening. And Ashford daughters understand their responsibilities to this family. The word responsibilities landed with all its weight. Clara had been hearing it her entire life, applied to every situation in which what was meant was not responsibility at all, but compliance. Sit quietly, smile correctly. Do not argue with Councilman Tate at the harvest dinner, even when he is wrong, which he frequently is. Do not spend your mornings fixing fences and your afternoons riding the perimeter and your evenings reading surveying manuals, because none of that is appropriate for a young woman of your station. Do not be who you are. Be who we need you to be. "When do I leave?" Clara asked. Harlan blinked. He had been preparing for resistance, she could tell. The question caught him off balance. 2 weeks, he said, recovering. His men will come for you. Fine, Clara said. Then we're done here. She walked out of the sitting room and through the kitchen and out the side door, and she sat down on the back step in the cold October air, and she breathed in, out. The kind of breathing you do when you are holding something very large inside your chest, and you are not yet ready to put it down. She did not cry. She had learned years ago that crying in the Ashford house was simply giving people ammunition. Supper that night was quiet. Harlan was in high spirits of the private kind, the kind he did not display openly because displaying them would require acknowledging why he was relieved, and acknowledging that would mean acknowledging the debts. Meredith was focused on logistics, mentally cataloging what arrangements would need to be made. Constance made a genuine effort to be kind, which Clara recognized and appreciated even if it changed nothing. Nell ate her meal and looked at her plate and said nothing. Clara ate everything on her plate because she was genuinely hungry and because small practical rebellions were the only kind she had left. She went to bed at 9, which was earlier than usual, but she did not sleep. She lay in the small bedroom, the smallest of the three daughters' rooms, the one with the window that stuck in damp weather, and the floorboard near the closet that creaked. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle, and she thought about the figure her father had named, that sum of money that could solve his problems so thoroughly that he had not paused for even a moment before accepting the proposal on behalf of a daughter who had not been consulted. At 10:30, she heard voices from the study below. She should not have gotten up. She knew that. She lay there for 2 full minutes, telling herself that knowing was not the same as needing to hear that whatever they said in private was not something she had any right to witness, that she was better off not knowing. Then she got up, wrapped her blanket around her shoulders, and crept to the top of the stairs. Her father's voice carried clearly in the quiet house. He was not trying to be quiet. Why would he be? The servants were in the east wing. The girls were in their rooms. He was talking to his wife in his own study about his own business. Absolute stroke of luck, he was saying. I had stopped thinking there was any solution to the Brennan note before spring. And then this. I still can't quite believe it. Meredith's voice was lighter than it ever was in public, the voice she used when she was not performing. Of all the girls for him to ask for. I know. A pause, the sound of liquid being poured. The man must have peculiar taste or peculiar motives. Either way, his money is good. Do you think we should tell him something about her? Meredith asked. About her temperament, about the incident with the fence workers last spring or the dinner with the councilman's party. Absolutely not, Harlan said without hesitation. We tell him nothing that might cause him to change his mind. Once she is at Storm Ridge, she is his concern. If he cannot manage her, that is a problem he will have purchased along with everything else. They both laughed at that. It was a private joke between them, the comfortable laughter of two people who have been making the same kind of joke for years. The laughter of people who found something genuinely amusing. And what they found amusing was the idea of Ethan Croft, this powerful man, discovering what he had committed to. What a burden he had taken on. What a problem was now gloriously, irrevocably his. Clara's hand tightened on the banister. She could feel the wood grain pressing into her palm. I just hope he doesn't find a reason to send her back, Meredith said. He won't, Harlan said with the confidence of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in complications. His pride won't allow it. A man like that requesting a specific bride, making a formal proposal. He'd rather endure anything than admit he'd made an error. No, she'll stay, and the money will come. More laughter, another clink of glasses. Clara turned and walked back to her room, very carefully, very slowly. The way you move when something inside you is rearranging itself and you are not sure yet what it will look like when it settles. She closed the door behind her, sat down on the edge of her bed, put her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the wall. She had always told herself that her family simply did not understand her, that they were embarrassed by her, that she made their lives more complicated than they wanted them to be, that there was a fundamental difference in values between herself and the people she had grown up with. But she had also told herself, in the quiet place where she kept the things she was not ready to examine closely, that they loved her, in their way. Imperfectly and with significant reservations, but fundamentally underneath it all, they were her family. The laughter from the study had been the laughter of two people celebrating a relief, not a loss, not even an absence. A relief, a problem solved, an inconvenience removed. Something shifted in Clara Ashford's chest in the silence of her small bedroom. Not breaking, not yet. Something else. Something that felt, if she was honest with on herself, like the particular sensation of a lock being turned. She stood up, went to her closet, looked at the two good dresses her mother had insisted she own, both of which she disliked intensely because they required a different posture to wear, a careful and contained posture that was not hers. Then she looked at her work clothes, her functional dresses and her canvas trousers and her good riding coat and her boots. She looked at her small shelf of books, the surveying manual, the history of Wyoming territory she had read 3 times, the battered copy of a legal primer she had borrowed from old Silas and quietly never returned. She took out her travel bag, the plain canvas one that she used for overnight trips to Cheyenne with her father on ranch business. She packed her work clothes. She packed her books. She left the good dresses where they were. She took the pocket watch that had belonged to her grandmother and that Meredith had never bothered to reclaim because it was plain silver with no decorative value and therefore not worth fighting over. She took it and wrapped it in a kerchief and put it in the inside pocket of her traveling coat. Then she sat back down on the bed and looked at what she had packed. If she was going, she would go as herself, not as the version of herself her family wanted to present to a stranger, not in silk and with her hair arranged and her mouth carefully controlled. If Ethan Croft wanted a Clara Ashford, he was going to receive the actual one, the inconvenient one, the one who fixed fences and argued with councilmen and had mud on her arm at family meetings. And if that caused him to regret his proposal, then she would have her answer about him. And she would deal with that when the time came. For the first time that evening, Clara permitted herself the smallest fraction of something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. The next morning she rose before dawn. She found old Silas at the south fence where they had left off the day before. He looked at her face and then looked at the fence post he was about to drive and drove it. "They told you," he said. "They told me." "Croft," he said, not a question. "Yes." Old Silas was quiet for a long time. He drove 3 more posts before he spoke again. "There's something you should know," he said finally. "Something I probably should have told you sooner, but I wasn't sure it was my place, and then the letter came, and now I think it is." Clara waited. "I knew his father," old Silas said. "Edwin Croft. We traded horses together for nearly 15 years before he passed. I used to ride up to Storm Ridge twice a year, spring and fall, and stay 3 or 4 days. Ethan was there for all of it. I watched him grow up, watched him take over after his father died. You know him." "I knew him. He's different now, older, but some things don't change in a person." Old Silas paused. "About 2 years ago, I got a letter from him, out of the blue. He wanted to know about the Ashford family, specifically about you." Clara stopped walking. He had questions. Careful questions, the kind a man asks when he is not asking out of idle curiosity. He wanted to know what kind of person you were, whether you were as he remembered. As he remembered, Clara repeated. When did he ever see me? He came through Redstone Creek about 2.5 years ago. Horse trading business, bought a string of 4 from Pickett. He was in town for 2 days. Old Silas looked at her directly. You remember the business with the fence workers, Calloway's crew, the men he hired for the summer and then tried to withhold their final wages from claiming the work wasn't finished when everyone could see it was. Clara remembered. She remembered it with the particular vividness that attaches to moments of genuine anger. She had been in town to pick up supplies, and she had come upon 4 men standing outside Calloway's office, hats in their hands, trying to be heard and not succeeding. She had walked into the office and she had said in front of 3 other businessmen who were present that Thaddeus Calloway owed those men their wages and intended to pay them immediately, or she would be happy to explain to Judge Whitmore at his next sitting exactly what delayed payment of contracted labor looked like under the territory statutes, which she had in fact looked up specifically because Old Silas had mentioned the situation to her that morning. Calloway had paid. Her mother had not spoken to her for 2 weeks. He was there, Old Silas said simply, standing on the other side of the street. He saw the whole thing. Clara stared at the fence post. He watched me argue with a local merchant about wage theft and decided he wanted to marry me. He watched you stand up for 4 men who had no other advocate in a situation where every other person present either agreed with Calloway or was too uncertain of the consequences to speak. He watched you do that with no personal stake in the outcome and no concern for what it cost you socially. Old Silas picked up his tools. And then 2 years later, he wrote me a letter asking if you were as he remembered. What did you tell him? The truth, that you were exactly as he remembered, possibly more so. He paused. I don't know what kind of man Ethan Croft is now. I know what kind of boy he was, and I know what kind of man his father was, and those 2 things are not the same. But I know this. He didn't write asking about your family's social position or your mother's connections or what you'd bring to an alliance. He asked about you, what you were like, what mattered to you. Clara was quiet for a long moment. That doesn't mean anything will be good, she said finally. No. Old Silas agreed. It doesn't, but it's not nothing either. It was not nothing. She held that through the 2 weeks that followed. She held it through her mother's flurry of preparations, the ordering of a dress Clara would not wear, and the planning of a small ceremony Clara was not consulted about, and the letters Meredith wrote to the family's social acquaintances, framing the arrangement in terms that cast it as a triumph rather than an expedient. She held it through her father's single additional conversation with her on the matter which took place in his study the day before Croft's men were due to arrive. You're not going to fight this, he said. It was not entirely a question. I'm going, Clara said. Good. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who wanted to say something further, but could not determine what it should be. Try to conduct yourself appropriately when you arrive. First impressions are significant. I understand the first impressions, Clara said. Clara. He said her name with a kind of heaviness that might have been many things. She waited. This is the right decision. For the family. I know, she said. That's why you made it. She left before he could respond. She did not want to hear what he might have said next. Some doors were better left in the position you found them. The night before departure, Meredith insisted on a family dinner. The cook made the Sunday roast on a Thursday. Constance wore her second best dress. Nell had brushed her hair. Harlan sat at the head of the table and carved the roast with the ceremony he brought to such things the performance of a patriarch presiding over his household. Clara wore her second work dress, the one without the patched elbow, which was the only concession she made. No one commented. The conversation moved around her like water around a stone. Constance talked about William's family property in Cheyenne. Nell asked their father about a mare that had been limping. Meredith mentioned a social engagement the following month. No one asked Clara anything. No one asked if she was ready. No one asked if she was afraid or what she thought about the man she was being sent to marry or what she might be leaving behind. Halfway through the meal, Clara set down her fork. "I would like to say something," she said. The conversation stopped. Everyone looked at her. "I know what this family thinks of me," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd been practicing steadiness for 22 years, and she was good at it. "I know you find me difficult. I know I have caused embarrassment and complicated things that would have been simpler if I had been more like Constance, or even more like Nell." She looked at each of them in turn. "I want you to know that I have known this for a long time. I heard the conversation in the study the night the letter arrived." The silence was absolute. Constance's eyes went to her plate. Nell's face had gone pale. Meredith's expression was very carefully composed. Harlan said nothing. "I'm not saying this to cause a scene," Clara continued. "I'm saying it because I would like you to understand something before I leave. I am not going because you want me to go. I am not going because Ethan Croft's money solves a problem I am not supposed to know about. I am going because I have spent my entire life in this house and there has never been a place in it that was mine. Not one room, not one morning, not one conversation in which what I thought or felt or believed mattered to anyone sitting at this table." She stood. "Thank you for dinner. It was very good." She looked at Constance. "I hope you are happy with William. I mean that." She looked at Nell. "Don't stay quiet forever, Nell. You have things worth saying." She looked at her mother, then her father, and found she had nothing left to say to either of them that would not simply open a wound that would not heal before she was gone. She pushed in her chair and walked out. Behind her, she heard her mother's voice low and tight with something that was not quite anger. "Harlan," and her father's voice tired in a way she had not heard before. "Let her go, Meredith. She leaves in the morning." Clara climbed the stairs to her small bedroom for the last time. She did not pack anything else. She had packed everything that mattered. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked out the window that stuck and watched the moon move across the sky and thought about who she was and who she might be somewhere else in some other situation seen by some other person. She thought about a man standing on the other side of a street in Redstone Creek, watching her argue with a merchant about what was right and what was owed. Watching her with the kind of attention that remembered that carried something forward across 2.5 years and became a letter and became a proposal and became this night, this window, this particular quality of October moonlight. She did not sleep much, but what sleep she got was dreamless and solid, the sleep of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it, even if she is not at peace with everything surrounding it. Dawn came cold and clear. Clara rose with it. She dressed in her best work clothes, the canvas trousers and the good flannel shirt and the riding coat that fit properly. She braided her hair herself tight and practical, and she looked in the mirror once, just once. And the person looking back at her was not the daughter her family wanted her to be, and was not the refined young woman she had spent years being pressured to become. She was simply herself, as she was, without apology or adjustment. She picked up her canvas travel bag and walked downstairs. They were all there in the front hall. Meredith in her dressing gown, her hair still pinned for the night. Harlan already dressed holding his watch. Constance and Nell standing close together in the way they had when they were small girls when thunder came. Outside through the front windows, Clara could see 3 horses and 3 riders waiting. Croft's men arrived at first light. Meredith looked at what Clara was wearing, and her expression did something complicated. "You cannot go like that," she said. "His men are waiting. They will form an impression." "Yes," Clara said, "they will." She walked past her mother, past her father, who opened his mouth and closed it again, past Constance, who looked at her with an expression that was not quite envy and not quite sorrow, but was somewhere in the territory between them, past Nell, who reached out and touched her arm for just a moment, just a brief press of her fingers, not a word, but something nonetheless. Clara went out the front door. The morning air hit her face sharp and clean. 3 men sat on horses in the pale light. The oldest of them, gray-haired with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades doing hard work in difficult country, touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Ashford." "That's me. I'm ready." "I'm Grady, ranch foreman at Storm Ridge. That's Cooper, and that's Wilt." He gestured to a 4th horse already saddled beside them. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am." Clara turned back one final time. Her family stood in the open doorway. Meredith's face was unreadable in the morning shadow. Harlan looked tired. Constance had her hand at her mouth. Nell was crying silently, one hand raised. None of them said goodbye. Clara turned back to the horse. She swung up into the saddle the way she had been doing since she was 8 years old, with the ease of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become part of the body's knowledge rather than the mind's. She settled her bag behind her. She gathered the reins. "Let's go," she said. They rode north. She did not look back, not because she was performing anything, not because she was trying to make a point, but because there was nothing behind her that she needed to see. Behind her was a house where she had been a problem to be solved. Ahead of her was 3 days of riding in a mountain, and a man who, for reasons she had not yet fully examined, had spent 2.5 years thinking about who she was. Ahead of her was something she did not yet have a name for, but that felt in the cold morning light, with the frost crunching under the horse's hooves, and the Redstone Creek Valley falling away behind her like the beginning of something. The horses moved north. The mountains were already visible, blue and vast against the October sky, their upper reaches dusted white with the first snow that had come early this year, and would not be the last. Storm Ridge was up there somewhere. A man named Ethan Croft was up there somewhere, waiting for a woman his family thought they were throwing away. Clara Ashford rode toward the mountains, and she did not know what she was riding toward. She knew only what she was riding away from, and she had made her peace with that in the small hours of a sleepless night, watching the moon cross her stuck window. Whatever came next was hers to determine. She intended to do exactly that. The 3 men from Storm Ridge rode in comfortable silence on either side of her, and by midday they had left the valley entirely and were climbing into country that grew rougher and more honest with every mile. And Clara breathed the cold, clean air of it and thought that honesty at least was a thing she understood. The journey north took 3 days and changed something in Clara Ashford that she could not have named precisely, but could feel the shape of. On the first day they rode through the lower country, the familiar terrain of the Redstone Creek Valley, giving way gradually to something wilder and less managed. The grass grew coarser. The trees, which had been the cultivated cottonwoods and planted windbreaks of ranching country, became something older and less concerned with human preference. Pine and spruce climbing the slopes in dense, dark stands. Aspen groves gone gold and trembling in the October wind, their leaves coming down in slow, continuous showers that covered the trail in a carpet of pale yellow. Grady rode mostly ahead, Cooper and Wilt flanked her without crowding her, which she appreciated. Nobody offered to carry her bag a second time after she declined the first offer. Nobody suggested she might want to stop and rest at intervals that were closer together than the ones the men would have chosen for themselves. They treated her, she noticed, with the specific respect of people who have been told something about a person and are adjusting their behavior accordingly. On the evening of the first day, camped beside a creek that ran fast and cold with snowmelt, she asked Grady directly, "What did Mr. Croft tell you about me?" Grady looked at her across the fire. He had the face of a man who had spent 40 years deciding when to speak and when not to, and he appeared to be making that calculation now. "He said you weren't like the others," he said finally. "What others?" "Other women who'd been proposed to him over the years. Families that put themselves forward. He'd met a few. None of them took. He poked the fire with the stick. He said you were different. Said that's why he asked for you specifically." "Different how?" Grady almost smiled. He didn't elaborate. Mr. Croft isn't much for elaborating. Clara considered that. A man who watched carefully and spoke rarely. She thought she understood that kind of person. She had spent her life surrounded by people who spoke constantly and watched nothing. The second day took them higher. The air thinned noticeably and Clara's lungs worked harder without her mentioning it. The trail narrowed and the views opened, the valley falling away below them in a sweep of autumn color that would have been beautiful if she had been in any mood to find things beautiful, which she was working toward. The horse had moved steadily. Grady knew this trail the way a person knows a road they have traveled in every season and in every kind of light. On the evening of the second day, Clara helped with the camp without being asked, collecting wood and unpacking the food supplies with the practical efficiency of someone accustomed to making herself useful. Cooper watched this with barely concealed surprise. "You do that like you've done it before," he said. "I've camped before." "Rich ranch girls don't usually camp." "I'm not usually a rich ranch girl," Clara said. "I'm usually the person who fixes what the rich ranch girl's horse broke when it got through the fence." Cooper laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that acknowledged something real had been said. Wilt, who had said almost nothing in 2 days, looked up from his coffee and nodded once, which Clara interpreted as the highest available form of approval. By the third afternoon, everything had changed. The trail came around a long curve of rock face and the country opened before them, and Clara pulled her horse up without intending to. She simply stopped because what she was looking at required stopping. Storm Ridge Ranch was built into the southern face of the mountain, like it had grown there, like it had considered its position carefully over many years, and decided on it with geological deliberation. The main house was timber and stone, 2 stories with a broad porch running the full width of the front face. Around it, in a pattern that was clearly functional rather than decorative, cluster barns, outbuildings, a smithy whose chimney sent a thin thread of smoke straight up in the still afternoon air, corrals where horses moved in the easy way of animals that are well kept and know it, gardens that had been put to bed for winter but showed the evidence of serious cultivation, workers' cabins set back at respectful distances, and people. Clara had not expected so many people, moving between the buildings with the purposeful ease of a community that knows its own rhythms. A woman hanging washing, 2 men repairing something at the fence line, a child running an errand with the serious expression of someone entrusted with something important. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "Most people say that," Grady said, "and they haven't seen the north pasture yet." They rode in through the main gate. Heads turned. She felt the assessment happening, the careful collective attention of a community examining a newcomer, and she sat straight in her saddle and looked back at every face that looked at her and did not perform anything, did not smile decoratively or arrange herself into a picture of appropriate femininity. She was what she was. They could determine what they made of it. Grady dismounted at the main house. "Wait here, I'll tell Mr. Croft you've arrived." Clara sat on her horse and waited. Her heart was beating in a way she was deliberately not attending to, a rapid and unsteady rhythm that had no place in the stillness she was trying to maintain. She breathed slowly. She looked at the mountains rising behind the compound granite and the snow, utterly indifferent to the small human arrangements happening at their feet. There was something steadying about that indifference, something honest. The door opened. A man walked out. Clara had been constructing a version of Ethan Croft in her mind for 2 weeks, assembling him from stories and one old man's memories and the architecture of a legend. She had imagined someone severe, someone whose power was visible in coldness. The kind of man who commanded through the specific gravity of his indifference to everyone around him. The man walking toward her was not that. He was tall, broader through the shoulders, and she had anticipated with the particular build of someone who has done serious physical work for decades and whose body has shaped itself accordingly. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that had weather in it, lines that came from sun and cold, and the particular wear of a life spent outdoors. A scar along his jawline that had healed clean but white. His hands, which she could see as he approached, were calloused and scarred in the specific patterns of ranch work. But his eyes were what stopped her, dark and direct. They moved to her face and stayed there with an attention that was not calculating and was not appraising in the way she had expected. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about for a long time and are finally seeing clearly. He stopped a few feet from her horse and looked up at her. "Clara Ashford," he said. His voice was deep and quiet, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. "Welcome home." Clara did not move from the saddle. She sat there and looked down at him and waited for the catch. There was always a catch. "This isn't my home," she said. "Not yet," he said, "but it could be." He stepped back and gestured toward the house with the calm of a man who was not performing anything and did not need to. "You've had a long ride. Come inside. We can talk." She dismounted without his assistance, landing hard enough that her boots kicked up dust, and she picked up her own bag before anyone else could reach for it. She followed him toward the house, aware of the eyes on her, the community watching this arrival, and she thought, let them look. Let them see exactly what has come to Storm Ridge. No pretending, no performance. Just Clara Ashford with her canvas bag and her work clothes and the grandmother's watch in her inside pocket and the entirely unresolved question of what came next. Inside the house was nothing like the Ashford main house. There was no wallpaper, no imported furniture chosen for its look rather than its use. Everything was wood-heavy and warm, worn smooth in the places where hands and bodies had been using it for years. The floors were wide plank pine clean, but marked by decades of boots. The ceiling beams were rough-hewn. The fireplace in the main room was a massive stone construction that looked capable of heating the entire building, which in Wyoming winters it probably needed to be. And books. An entire wall of shelves carrying books that were clearly read, not displayed. Spines cracked and covers bent and pages dog-eared at places where something had been worth returning to. Ethan Croft pulled out a chair at the long oak table. "Sit," he said. "Are you hungry?" "I'm fine." "You rode 3 days. You're hungry." He moved to the stove without waiting for her answer. Clara sat down and watched the most powerful rancher in northern Wyoming ladle soup into a bowl and cut bread from a loaf that had clearly been made that morning. He set both in front of her with a cup of coffee, black and strong, the kind that was made for mornings that started before dawn. Eat, he said, sitting across from her. Then we'll talk. She ate. The soup was venison rich and seasoned with something she did not immediately identify. She was hungrier than she had admitted, and she ate steadily, not hurrying, not pretending she wasn't hungry. Across the table, Ethan Croft watched her with an attention that was difficult to categorize. Not the way men sometimes watched women, with the particular quality of assessment that made her feel like something being valued for its surface. He watched her the way a person watches something they are genuinely trying to understand. She set down her spoon. "Why me?" she said. "Direct. Good. I don't care what you find good. I want an answer." He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that might have been satisfaction, though she was not prepared to call it that yet. "I saw you," he said. "About 2.5 years ago, I was in Redstone Creek on business. There was a situation in the street outside Calloway's office." The memory arrived complete and immediate. The four men with their hats in their hands. Thaddeus Calloway in his office, with the smug certainty of a man who has always been able to ignore inconvenient people. Herself walking in because walking past was not something she could do when she could see clearly what was happening. "You were there," she said. "I was across the street. I watched the whole thing." He paused. "Every person on that street knew what Calloway was doing was wrong. Not one of them said anything. Except you. He called me hysterical. He called you worse than that before he stopped. You didn't move." Ethan looked at her steadily. "You stood there until he counted out every coin he owed those men, in front of everyone, at significant personal cost. My mother didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. I know, I asked about you afterward. Enough to understand what standing up in that street actually cost someone in your position." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. "I thought you were the most straightforwardly brave person I had seen in a long time." Clara looked at her hands. "Most people thought I was making trouble. Most people were watching trouble get made and doing nothing to stop it. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "I run a large operation, 40 people year-round more at Roundup. I have been running it alone for 17 years since my father died and left me with a ranch that was more debt than asset and a workforce that was waiting to see whether I was worth staying for." He glanced toward the window toward the compound outside. "What I have built here did not come from being able to do every job on this property. It came from knowing which people to trust and being willing to give them real responsibility. Partners, not employees." "And you want a partner," Clara said. "I want someone who can stand in that street and not move." He met her gaze directly. "Someone who sees what is right and does something about it regardless of the cost. Someone who does not need me to tell her what needs doing because she can see it for herself." He paused. "I have met any number of women who are accomplished and refined and would make the sort of wife that looks right at social occasions. I am not interested in what looks right." Clara studied him, looking for the angle, looking for the hidden terms and conditions. "You could be telling me what I want to hear," she said. "I could, um," he agreed. "You'll have time to determine whether I am." "What does that mean?" "It means I am not going to ask you to marry me tonight." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the compound where the afternoon light was going gold, and the work was continuing, the life of the place carrying on as it always did. "There is something else you should know. I told your father I would send the bride price after the wedding. I have no intention of doing that." Clara stared at him. That was the agreement. The agreement was that I would marry a daughter of the Ashford family. I did not agree to purchase a human being. Those are not the same thing. His jaw tightened. I know why your father accepted this proposal so quickly. I know what his financial situation is. I have made it my business to know because I needed to understand what I was walking into. He turned back to face her. I will not give that man money for treating his daughter like a commodity, not 1 cent. He'll be furious. He can be furious in the valley. He has no authority here. Clara was very still. She was processing the specific shape of what he was saying, the particular form of it. He was not simply declining to pay. He was making a moral declaration and acting on it regardless of the practical consequences, which included the anger of a man with social connections and a grievance. She understood that kind of action. She had taken that kind of action herself more than once, and she understood precisely what it cost. Here is what I'm offering, Ethan said. He came back to the table but did not sit standing at the far end with his hands resting on the wood. Stay for 1 month. No obligations beyond working alongside everyone else here and learning what this place is and whether it suits you. At the end of that month, if you want to leave, I will give you a horse and enough money to go anywhere you choose and start over on your own terms. No strings, no consequences. And if I want to stay, then we discuss what that looks like together. As two people who have made a choice, not an arrangement. His eyes held hers. There is a room upstairs. The door locks from the inside. You will be safe here, Clara. I give you my word. She looked at him for a long time, long enough to see that he was not performing this, long enough to see that the word he had just given was the kind that came from somewhere solid, the kind of word that a person gives when they mean it to hold. 1 month, she said. 1 month, he agreed, and then we'll see. He nodded once. Then he held out his hand, not to seal a deal, not in the formal transactional sense. He held it out the way you hold out a hand to someone you are inviting somewhere and want to show the way. Let me show you the ranch, he said. She took his hand. They shook once like two people who had agreed on something that mattered, and then he walked her out into the late afternoon light and began to show her what he had built. It took several hours to see even a portion of it. He walked her past the barns where the horses moved with the easy contentment of animals that were well fed and regularly worked. Past the cattle operation, the corrals and the grazing land beyond them, the careful management of which pastures were used in which sequence to preserve the grass through winter. Past the workers' cabins, past the smithy where a man named Thomas was finishing the day's work, and nodded to Ethan with the comfortable ease of long familiarity. Past the kitchen gardens put to bed for winter, but clearly productive, and the root cellar where the summer's harvest was stored against the cold months. He introduced her to people as they passed. Grady, whom she had already met, a woman named Bessie who ran the kitchens with an authority that was immediately apparent, and who looked at Clara with sharp dark eyes and reserved judgment in a way that Clara found oddly reassuring. A younger woman named Wren, red-haired and freckled, who smiled at Clara with the particular warmth of someone who had been told to look out for a specific person and was genuinely glad to do it. Everyone they passed acknowledged Ethan with the specific quality of respect that comes from genuine trust, not from fear or obligation or social hierarchy. They looked at him the way people look at someone who has proven something to them over time. Clara noted this carefully. It was not performance, and it was not theater. It was simply what this place was. She was standing at the overlook above the compound, looking down at the full scope of Storm Ridge in the fading afternoon light, when she said, "How many people live here year-round?" "About 40. more in the busy seasons. He stood beside her, looking at the same view with the look of someone who has not yet gotten used to it even after 17 years. Most of them came here with nothing. A few came from situations they were leaving. Ren, for instance. Ren, her husband. He said it simply without editorializing. She arrived here 6 years ago with her daughter in one bag. I didn't ask for details. I asked if she wanted work and a place to stay. He paused. That is what this place is, Clara. It is not simply a ranch. It is a place where people who needed somewhere to be could build something real. Clara thought about that. She thought about the Ashford house where everything was maintained for the performance of prosperity, where the surface was tended and the rot underneath was managed carefully out of sight, where the people in it were arranged around a central project of appearance rather than a central project of something that actually meant anything. Your father built this, she asked. He started it. He was a hard man. Good at the work, not good at much else. When I took over, half the hands quit because they didn't believe I'd actually run things differently. His voice was level, but there was something under it. First winter, I lost 30 head because I didn't know enough yet. Second year, there was a fire that took 2 of the barns. Third year, my mother died. He said it without inflection, which told her how much inflection there actually was held carefully below the surface. And I realized I was completely alone up here. Just me and the work and 40 people depending on the work. I'm sorry, Clara said. She didn't want to be here, he said quietly. She never chose this. My father brought her here right after they were married, and she spent 20 years trying to make herself fit into something she hadn't chosen. I watched her get smaller every year, quieter, further from whatever she had been before she came here. He looked at the mountains with the specific expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has learned to carry it without showing the weight. I was 19 when she died. I never asked her if she had been happy. I didn't know if the answer would have been something I could hold. Clara looked at his profile in the failing light. She thought about what it meant to spend 19 years watching someone disappear by degrees in a life they had not chosen. She thought about what that kind of witnessing did to a person, what it made them determined about. Show me more tomorrow, she said. The days found their rhythm. Clara woke before dawn because that was when she woke and found the kitchen already alive when she arrived, Bessie moving through the organized chaos of feeding 40 people, with the authority of a general who has run this particular campaign many times. Bessie put her to work without ceremony and without condescension, which Clara recognized as a form of respect. She learned to make bread that did not come out like a stone, which took 4 attempts, and Bessie's pointed commentary on each one. She learned what Wren knew about the medicinal herbs kept in the still room, which plants addressed which complaints, how to make a poultice for an infected cut, when the doctor was 3 days away by horse, which in Wyoming winter was a practical, rather than a theoretical concern. She rode out with Grady to check fence lines in the north pasture and asked him questions about the land management and the winter feeding plan with the specific curiosity of someone who actually wanted to understand how things worked rather than how they appeared to work. Nobody told her to sit down. Nobody suggested that her interest in how the smithy operated or the specific drainage challenges of the south pasture or the accounting system Grady used to track supplies was inappropriate for a person of her gender or station. Nobody looked at the mud on her boots and drew a conclusion about her character. It was, Clara thought, during the second evening, as she helped set the tables for the communal dinner, the first sustained period of her adult life in which being exactly herself had not produced a consequence. On the fifth day, Thomas the blacksmith, a stocky man of about 50, with the hands and forearms of someone who has swung a hammer every day for 30 years, looked at her, attempting to straighten a bent horseshoe, and said without inflection, "You're holding it like it's going to bite you." "I'm trying not to hit my fingers." "You'll hit your fingers either way if you keep that grip. Here." He adjusted her hand around the handle, not gently exactly, but precisely, with the specific communication of a craftsman correcting a technique. "Let the weight do the work. The hammer doesn't need your muscle, it needs your direction." She tried again. The metal rang differently, cleaner. "Better," Thomas said, and went back to his own work. It was Clara understood the highest praise available in that particular vocabulary. On the sixth night, everything changed. She was helping Bessie with the evening cleanup when Wren came running into the kitchen with her face white beneath her freckles. "It's Ida Hartwell," she said. "The baby's coming. It's early, real early." The organized calm of the kitchen dissolved instantly into a different kind of organization. Ethan appeared within minutes, already sending Cooper for the doctor in town. Martha, who had some medical knowledge and served as the ranch's practical health resource when the doctor was unavailable, was already moving toward the Hartwell cabin. Clara followed without being asked. The cabin was small and warm and full of the particular kind of fear that comes when something is happening that cannot be slowed or stopped. Ida Hartwell lay on the bed, her face sheened with sweat, her husband Owen standing near the wall with the helpless look of a man who cannot fix the thing that most needs fixing. Martha worked with quiet efficiency, her face giving nothing away. Clara sat down beside Ida and took her hand. "Hey," she said, "I'm Clara. I'm going to stay right here with you." "It's too early," Ida said. Her voice was thin with pain and fear. "The baby's not supposed to come yet." "I know, but you are strong and help is coming, and I'm not going anywhere." She stayed. Through the hours of it, through the progression of something she had no medical training to manage, but which she understood at some level below training, the level of one person being present with another person in extremity. She talked to Ida when talking helped, and was quiet when quiet helped, and kept Owen from completely unraveling by giving him small, practical tasks: more water, another blanket, hold this lamp steady, things that gave his hands something to do while his heart was doing what hearts do in such moments. The doctor arrived just past midnight. He had ridden hard and came through the door with his bag already open. Martha gave him a precise accounting of the situation and stepped back to give him room. Clara stepped back too, releasing Ida's hand only when Ida's grip loosened enough to allow it. Just before 2 in the morning, the baby came and did not cry. The room went very still. The particular stillness of hell breath of every person present, suspending themselves in the moment between what was and what would be. The doctor worked with swift and focused hands. Martha worked beside him. Owen made a sound that Clara would hear in her memory for a long time, a sound that had no name, but that contained everything a person feels when they are waiting to know whether the thing they love most in the world will exist in the next moment. 40 seconds. Clara counted them, and then the baby cried. It was thin and high and improbably strong for something so small, and it was the most complete sound Clara had ever heard in her life. Ida sobbed and reached, and the doctor placed the baby wrapped now and breathing into her arms and kept working, kept watching, but the worst had passed. The room breathed again. Owen crossed himself, though Clara would not have guessed him a religious man. Martha's shoulders dropped a fraction. Clara walked out onto the small porch of the cabin and stood in the cold night air and shook. Not from cold, from the release of something she had been holding rigidly in place for 2 hours. The controlled calm she had maintained for Ida's sake, the steadiness she had performed because Ida needed steadiness from her. She stood in the dark and breathed and felt the shaking move through her like a wave and let it. And then she wept. Not quietly or politely. She wept in the way she had not permitted herself to weep in her own bedroom on the night of the family dinner, or on the morning she rode away from the Ashford house, or in any of the preceding years in which weeping in the Ashford household had meant exposure, had meant giving people something to use. She wept because she was 22 years old, and she had spent that age maintaining a posture of invulnerability in a house where vulnerability was a liability, and she was standing in the dark on a mountain in Wyoming, next to a cabin where a baby had just chosen to live, and something about that choice had unlocked something in her that had been locked for a very long time. She heard a sound behind her and turned, still weeping, not yet controlled, and Ethan Croft was standing in the doorway. He did not say anything. He looked at her with an expression that was not pity and was not discomfort and was not the particular male awkwardness that she had seen on the faces of men confronted with a woman's distress and wishing they were somewhere else. He looked at her with recognition, as if he understood precisely what was happening and knew that it did not require him to fix it or manage it or respond to it with anything other than presence. He stepped out onto the porch. He put his hand on her shoulder for one moment, not to comfort in the patronizing sense, not to perform sympathy, but the way you put your hand on someone's shoulder when you are standing beside them and want them to know that they are not standing alone. Then he took his hand away and stood beside her, and they both looked at the dark mountains and the cold stars until she was finished. "How are they?" she said finally. "Good," he said. "Doctor says the baby has a real chance. Ida's strong." A pause. "You kept her that way tonight, and Owen. You kept them both steady when neither one of them could have managed it alone. I just held her hand." "That was everything they needed," he said, "someone who would not leave." She looked at him then in the dark, at the man who had watched her from across the street 2.5 years ago and had remembered what he saw. She thought about what it meant to be someone who did not leave when things became difficult. She thought about what it meant to choose to remain in the harder position because remaining was what the situation required. She thought she might be beginning to understand why he had asked for her specifically. What happened on the 11th day was something that Clara had not anticipated, and that rearranged everything she thought she understood about Ethan Croft. They were walking the perimeter of the eastern pasture, checking the fence line after a stretch of hard wind, when she asked him the question she had been carrying since the night of the baby. "Why did you really give me the choice, the monthly option to leave? Why did that matter so much to you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My mother," he said finally. "I told you last night that she never wanted to be here, that she spent 20 years making herself smaller." He stopped walking and looked out at the mountains, his jaw tight. "What I didn't tell you is the full shape of it. My father told me the year before he died how the arrangement had come about. He was proud of the story. He thought it was straightforward. A family that wanted their daughter gone, a man who needed a wife, a price agreed and paid." Something moved through his expression. He thought she should have been grateful. He genuinely could not understand why she wasn't. Clara waited. "When she died, I found her journals. She had kept them hidden for 20 years, written in them the things she had no other way of saying." He looked at the mountains the way a person looks at something that holds the memory of someone they cannot recover. She had wanted to be a school teacher. She had trained for it back in Missouri before she was married. She was good at it, her journal said. She loved it more than anything she had ever done. A long pause. She spent 20 years on this mountain wishing she was somewhere else, in a classroom, with children who were learning things. That was all she had ever wanted, and it was the thing she never got to have. Clara felt the weight of that settle over her. I read those journals when I was 19, and I made myself a promise, Ethan said, that if I ever brought someone here, they would come because they chose to, not because they had no other option, not because they had been purchased, because they had looked at this place and this life and decided with full understanding of what they were choosing that they wanted it. He turned to look at her, then directly without evasion. That is why the month matters. That is why the choice matters. Because my mother never had one, and I watched what that did to her across 20 years, and I will not replicate it. Not for anyone. Not even for someone I have been thinking about for 2.5 years. Clara looked at this man, at the specific kind of damage that was visible in him when he spoke of this, the kind that does not heal fully, but that a person learns to carry in a way that makes them more careful rather than less, more deliberate, more determined not to be the cause of something similar in another person's life. He was not perfect. He was not uncomplicated. He was a person who had survived difficult things and had let those things teach him rather than simply harden him. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. "You asked directly," he said. "You deserved a direct answer." On the 13th day the storm came. It arrived without the gradual escalation that sometimes accompanied bad weather, coming instead as a wall of dark cloud that moved over the mountains in the early afternoon with the specific speed of something that intends to be taken seriously. By 3 o'clock, the wind had picked up to a sustained howl. By 4, the snow was falling horizontally. Clara was in the smithy with Thomas when Grady came running. "South fence is down," he said to no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously. "Storm must have taken a post. The cattle are spooked and moving." The response was immediate and organized in the way of people who have drilled for this specific scenario many times. Everyone moved. Clara moved with them, pulling on the heavy waterproof coat that Bessie had pressed on her 3 days ago, with the flat observation that the weather would turn, and Clara's coat was inadequate for what turning weather meant up here. Outside, the world had become a gray, moving chaos. Snow and wind so thick that the far fence line was invisible. The cattle were audible, the particular sound of frightened livestock before they were visible. Clara rode hard behind Grady and 2 other men, her horse working through the deepening snow with the effort of something fighting a current. A cow broke from the group ahead of her and ran directly toward the southern fence line and the ravine beyond it. Clara kicked her horse without deliberating. She simply went, leaning low against the wind and the snow closing the distance between herself and the animal, with a focus so complete that she was not aware of thinking, only doing. She got ahead of the cow at the last moment, 15 feet from the fence line, and turned it with her body and her horse's body and the specific vocabulary of pressure and release that she had learned in the corrals of the Ashford ranch before she could legally sign her own name. The cow turned. She pushed it back toward the herd. "Good." Grady's voice cut through the wind somewhere behind and to her left. "Keep them moving north." They worked for 3 hours in the deteriorating weather. By the time the cattle were secured and the fence was patched with the emergency materials kept in the north barn for exactly this situation, the storm had passed its worst peak and was settling into the steady, serious snowfall that would continue until morning. Clara sat on her horse at the edge of the compound, soaked through, despite the waterproof coat. Her fingers stiff in her gloves, and felt beneath the cold and the exhaustion, something that she identified after a moment as satisfaction. The specific and honest satisfaction of having done something that needed doing in the specific conditions that made it difficult without anyone telling her she could or should or how to do it. Ethan found her on the porch steps, still in her wet things, staring at nothing in particular. He was as soaked and muddied as she was, which told her he had been out in it too. "You all right?" he asked. "I think so." "The cow at the south fence," he said. "You got there before anyone else." "I was closest. You were also fastest." He sat down beside her on the steps close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air. "You weren't thinking about whether it was your job to go after it." "It was in front of me," she said. "It needed stopping." That seemed like enough. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the compound where lights were coming on in the cabin windows as the evening settled. Then softly, "My mother would have been proud of what you did out there." Clara looked at him, at the exhaustion in his face and something underneath it that was not exhaustion at all. Something that had been sitting there since the conversation in the pasture 2 days ago and had not fully settled. "I'm glad she had you," Clara said finally, "even if she couldn't stay." He was quiet for a long moment. "So am I," he said, "every day." They sat together on the steps as the storm finished what it had come to do, and the cold deepened, and neither of them moved toward the warmth inside. On the 17th day, Wren told her something. They were mending tack together in the barn, a straightforward task that Clara had learned the mechanics of early, and that Wren did with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. Wren's daughter, a 6-year-old named Pearl, who had her mother's red hair and her mother's direct gaze, played in the clean hay nearby with a rag doll. "Can I ask you something personal?" Wren said without looking up from the leather she was working. "Yes." "When you came here, did you know anything about this place, about him?" "Stories," Clara said, "and what old Silas told me." "Old Silas?" Wren smiled slightly. "He's a good man. He knows Ethan well." She worked a stitch through carefully. "I'll tell you what I know. 6 years ago, I came here with Pearl, who was a baby in one bag. I had left a situation." She paused in the way of someone choosing their words with care. "My husband was not a good man. He was the kind of man that people like my family called a fine match because he had property and prospects, and they didn't ask about the things that mattered more than property." Clara listened. "I had nowhere to go and Pearl to think about, and I had heard that Storm Ridge took people on without asking too many questions. So I wrote up." Wren's hands continued moving, steady and skilled. "When I arrived, Ethan came out to meet me. He looked at me, looked at Pearl, looked at the one bag. He didn't ask how I'd gotten there or what I was leaving. He asked if I wanted work and a place to stay." She paused. "3 months later, my husband came, rode up to the property line with 2 of his hired men, and demanded I come back." "What happened?" "Ethan rode out to the property line with Grady and Thomas and 2 other men, and he told my husband that if he set one foot on Storm Ridge land, he would be answering for the trespassing in front of Judge Whitmore on the next court day, and that in the meantime, there were several people on this ranch willing to testify to the condition I had arrived in." Wren finished the stitch. "My husband left. He never came back." She looked at Clara directly for the first time in the conversation. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what it means when Ethan Croft says he will protect someone. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." That evening, Ethan found Clara in the barn visiting the horses. She was standing with Juniper, a gray mare that had been skittish around her for the first week and had finally decided 3 days ago to allow familiarity. "That's my mother's horse," he said from the doorway. "I know," Grady told me. "She's beautiful. She's also extremely stubborn, and has bitten 4 people in the last year. He walked into the barn. She seems to like you. We have things in common, Clara said. He almost smiled. She was learning the vocabulary of that expression, the small movements around his eyes and the slight relaxation of his mouth that constituted for Ethan Croft something most people would have called a smile. She was my mother's favorite, he said. Smart horse. Never trusted anyone she shouldn't. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something she did not immediately identify. He held it out to her. It was a knife in a leather sheath, the handle carved wood smooth, and fitted in a way that suggested it had been made for a specific hand. Her initials were burned into the leather of the sheath. C.A. Thomas made it, he said, at my request. He paused. Every person who works this ranch carries a knife. For cutting rope, fixing tack, whatever needs doing. I thought since you've been working this ranch alongside everyone else, you should have one. Clara took it. She drew the blade slightly from the sheath. The steel caught the barn light clean and sharp. She put it back. This doesn't mean anything beyond what I said, Ethan said. It doesn't mean you have to stay. It means while you're here, you're part of this place. Not a guest, not an obligation. Part of it. She looked at the sheath with her initials in the leather and felt something move in her chest that she was not ready to name. Thank you, she said. He nodded, moved to leave. Ethan, he stopped. When you watched me from across that street, she said, what were you actually thinking, not what you thought about me afterward? In the moment. What were you thinking? He turned back slowly. The barn was quiet around them, just the horses breathing and the October wind finding the gaps in the boards. He looked at her for a long moment. I thought the world needed more people willing to stand up when everyone else stays sitting down, he said. I thought whoever had raised you had either done something extraordinary or had completely failed to contain something that was always going to be what it was. A pause. And I thought that if I ever found someone like you, I would do whatever it took to make a case for why they might want to stay in my life. Clara looked at the knife in her hands. 9 days left, she said quietly. 9 days, he agreed. Ask me then, she said. Ask me properly. You'll know how when the time comes. He looked at her for one more moment. Yes, he said, I will. Then on the 20th day, Harlan Ashford rode onto Storm Ridge land. Clara was in the kitchen with Bessie when Grady came to the door. His face told her something was wrong before he opened his mouth. There are riders at the gate, he said, coming in from the south. 4 of them. A pause. Miss Ashford, I recognize the lead horse. She knew before she reached the window. She knew from the particular quality of Grady's voice, from the specific tension in his face, from the cold certainty that had begun forming in her chest the moment she heard the word riders. Her father's roan gelding was unmistakable. Harlan Ashford rode into the Storm Ridge compound like a man arriving at a social engagement, brushing trail dust from his coat with the precise gesture of someone performing composure. Behind him, 4 men rode with the particular posture of hired muscle people paid to lend weight to someone else's presence. Ethan was already on the porch. Mr. Ashford, his voice was the level, quiet voice he used when he was being very serious. I wasn't expecting you. I've come to check on my daughter, Harlan said. A father's prerogative. Your daughter is fine. You can leave now. Harlan dismounted with deliberate slowness, the gesture of a man who intended to be somewhere for longer than the other party wanted. I think I'll see her first. Speak with her privately. No, Ethan said. The word dropped into the compound like a stone. Harlan's eyes moved past Ethan to the house. Clara, he called, come out here. Clara was already at the door. She had put on her coat. She was not sure exactly when she had done that, whether it was a decision or simply something her body had done while her mind was attending to other things. She walked out onto the porch and stood beside Ethan and looked at her father. Harlan's expression moved through several configurations when he saw her. There was surprise, which told her he had expected to find her in a different condition, perhaps diminished, perhaps desperate. There was something that might briefly have been relief, which she catalogued and set aside. And then there was the expression she knew best, the one that preceded a performance of authority. "Sweetheart," he said. The word landed wrong as it always had, slightly too calculated, slightly too performed. "I came all this way to make sure you're being treated properly." "I'm being treated very well," Clara said. "Better than I've been treated in a long time." Harlan's jaw tightened slightly. "I'd like to speak with you privately. This is family business. Anything you want to say to me, you can say in front of everyone here." She looked at him steadily. "These people are more family to me than anyone who drove 4 hours from Redstone Creek to collect a debt." The pretense of the concerned father dropped away from Harlan Ashford's face like a mask slipping. Underneath it was the face she had seen in glimpses over 22 years, the face of a man for whom other people were primarily useful or not useful and who had run out of patience for the performance of something warmer. "Very well," he said. "I came to finalize the financial terms of this arrangement. Croft and I had an agreement." "We had a letter," Ethan said. "I wrote to you 3 weeks ago, indicating that the original terms were not acceptable to me and would need to be renegotiated. You did not respond." "The original terms were agreed." "The original terms required me to purchase your daughter. I don't do that." Harlan looked at Ethan with the particular expression of a man confronting an obstacle he had not anticipated and was rapidly calculating how to remove. "You made a proposal. My family accepted it. There are financial implications to breaking an agreement of this kind." "There is no agreement to break," Ethan said. "There is a woman on this property who came here of her own free will and is determining whether she wishes to remain. That is the entirety of the situation." Harlan's eyes moved to Clara. There was something in them she had not seen before, something that might have been genuine underneath the calculation. "Clara," he said, and his voice had shifted. "You're still my daughter. Whatever you think of the circumstances, that doesn't change." "I heard you that night," she said. The words landed quietly without heat. Harlan went very still. "After the letter came," Clara said, "after the family meeting, that night when you and Mother were in the study, I heard what you said about the bride price solving your problem, about hoping he wouldn't send me back." She held his gaze. "I heard you laughing." The compound was absolutely silent. Harlan Ashford stood in the October afternoon light with his hired men behind him and the people of Storm Ridge Ranch around him and the daughter he had sent away looking at him from the porch, and something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. It was not remorse exactly. It was the specific expression of a person who has been seen clearly and does not know what to do with being seen. "I think it's time for you to go," Ethan said quietly. Harlan looked at him. The calculation returned the hard, practical mind of a man who needed an outcome and was running out of routes to it. "You are making an enemy," he said. "I have connections in this territory, business relationships that extend across the valley, ranching community. I can make things difficult for an operation this size in ways you may not have considered." "I've considered them," Ethan said. "I've also considered that your financial situation is such that your influence is considerably less than it was 2 years ago. The people who did business with you because you were wealthy will reconsider those relationships now that you are not. I suggest you use your energy dealing with that reality rather than making threats you cannot support. Harlan looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara one final time. Don't come back asking for help when this fails, he said. You'll get nothing from me. I know, Clara said. I have known that for a long time. He mounted his horse. His men followed. He rode out of the Storm Ridge compound without looking back, which was, Clara thought, the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. When the sound of the hoofbeats faded, she became aware that her hands were trembling. Ethan stepped close beside her, not touching, just close. You're all right, he said. Yes, she said. And then, because it was true, and she was tired of saying things that were not true, not completely, but enough. That night, lying in her room with the door locked from the inside the way he had told her it would be, Clara looked at the knife on the table beside her bed, the one with her initials in the leather. She looked at the mountains through her window, silver and immense in the moonlight. 9 days had been reduced to 6, and she was not entirely certain she needed them. But she had asked him to wait, and she would let him wait because the decision she was arriving at was one she wanted to arrive at fully in full light, with full knowledge of what she was choosing. Not because she was afraid of the answer, because the answer deserved to be given properly. By someone who had taken the time to be completely certain. She was almost certain. She was almost home. The 6 remaining days passed with a quality Clara had not expected. Not anticipation exactly, though that was part of it. Something quieter. Something that felt like the specific stillness that precedes a decision already made when the mind has arrived somewhere and is simply waiting for the moment to declare it. She worked. She woke before dawn and helped Bessie with breakfast and rode out with Grady in the afternoons and spent her evenings by the fire in the main room, sometimes reading and sometimes simply sitting, watching the people of Storm Ridge move through their evenings with the easy familiarity of people who belong to the same thing. Wren's daughter, Pearl, had taken to sitting near Clara. At dinner, a small warm presence that asked questions with the relentless thoroughness of a 6-year-old and seemed satisfied by honest answers. Thomas the blacksmith had begun leaving small tasks near her workspace in the smithy, nothing he said explicitly, but a continuous quiet invitation. Bessie said nothing about any of it. But her bread lessons became longer and more detailed, and she began teaching Clara the specifics of the winter provisioning system, how to calculate what 40 people would need across 4 months of potential isolation, which supplies degraded, and which kept where the secondary stores were maintained in case the main root cellar was inaccessible. The practical knowledge of someone passing something on to someone who would need it. Ethan was present in the way he had been from the beginning, available without hovering, engaged without pressure. He showed her the accounting ledgers for the ranch on the 24th day, spreading them across the long oak table and walking her through the system with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone sharing something they considered genuinely shared. Not explaining it to her the way a person explains something to someone who will not be expected to use it, but explaining it the way you explain something to a partner who will need to understand it fully. She asked questions. He answered them. She pointed out what looked like an inefficiency in the supply chain tracking. And he looked at it for a moment and said simply that she was right and he would fix it. She went to bed that night holding the knife with her initials in the leather and thinking about a man who said she was right without qualification, without the subsequent erosion of a compliment that ends with but. On the 28th day, everything she had been building toward was interrupted. She was in the kitchen with Bessie just after breakfast, working through the morning bread, when she heard the sound of horses in the compound. multiple horses moving with the particular cadence of official arrival rather than the casual return of ranch hands from the morning work. She looked at Bessie. Bessie was already moving toward the window. Grady came to the kitchen door with his face arranged in the careful, neutral expression of someone delivering news he does not want to deliver. He looked at Clara first, which told her something. Then he looked beyond her to where Ethan had appeared in the doorway from the main room. "There are men at the gate," Grady said, "from the county. They have papers." The words landed with a particular weight that Clara recognized. Official papers. Men from the county. She thought of her father riding away from Storm Ridge 8 days ago with something hard and calculating in his eyes, and the cold, practical mind of a man who had not yet run out of routes to the outcome he needed. Ethan moved toward the front of the house. Clara moved with him. The men in the compound were 4 in number. They wore the clothing of official business, not uniform exactly, but close enough to communicate authority. The lead man was somewhere in his 40s, carrying a document that he held with the specific deliberateness of someone who knows the weight of what he is holding and wants to be sure others feel it too. "Ethan Croft," the man said. "That's right. I have a warrant for your detention pending investigation." He held out the paper. "You are accused of willful destruction of property belonging to the Ashford estate in Redstone Creek, specifically the burning of the grain storage building on the 14th of October. We have 2 witnesses who place you in Redstone Creek on the night in question." The compound had gone very still. People had appeared from various directions. The gradual gathering that happens when something significant occurs in a community and the community instinctively draws together. Grady was there, and Thomas and Wren with Pearl held close against her side. Bessie stood at the kitchen door. Cooper and Wilt near the far barn. Ethan looked at the warrant. His expression was the controlled stillness of a man processing something that is deeply wrong and determining the correct response to it rather than the immediate one. Clara watched his jaw tighten, watched his hands, which were very still, very deliberate. "I have not been in Redstone Creek in over a month," he said. "Your witnesses are lying." "That is a matter for a judge to determine," the lead man said. "You'll need to come with us." "And if I decline?" The 4 men shifted slightly, a collective adjustment that communicated that declining was not an available option in a way that would end cleanly. It was not threat exactly. It was simply the weight of institutional authority being made visible. Clara stepped forward. She stepped forward without deciding to, or rather she decided in the fraction of a second that sometimes contains all the deciding a person needs to do. She stepped to Ethan's side and she put her hand on his arm on the forearm just below the elbow, and she felt the muscle beneath her hand that was coiled with the effort of not doing the thing his instincts were telling him to do. "Ethan," she said. Her voice was very quiet, meant only for him. He looked at her. "This is what they want," she said. "They want a reason. They want you to give them something that turns this into something other than a false accusation. Don't give them that." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She held his gaze and did not look away, and let him see in her face that she knew what she was asking, and that she believed it was right, and that she was not going to be here less for it. He looked back at the lead man. He handed his rifle to Grady with the deliberate care of a man putting down something he has the right to carry. "I'll come," he said, "under formal protest noted here in front of these witnesses that this accusation is false and the witnesses you claim to have are lying for pay." "Noted," the lead man said in the tone of someone for whom the noting changes nothing. They processed out of the compound in the particular order of official detention, Ethan in the center of the 4 men, the horses moving at the walk that communicated controlled situation. Clara stood in the compound and watched him go. The people of Storm Ridge stood around her 40 people, watching something being done to one of their own, and nobody moved because there was nothing yet to do. Ethan turned in the saddle before they passed through the gate. He looked back at her. She held up her hand. Not a wave, a declaration. I am here. I am not going anywhere. I am going to handle this. He held her gaze for one moment. Then he turned forward and rode through the gate and was gone. The compound was silent. Clara turned to face the people around her, all of them, Thomas with his arms crossed, his face hard with something that was anger and something that was waiting. Grady standing straight, his hands still on the rifle Ethan had given him. Wren with Pearl, her expression fierce with a protectiveness that extended to Ethan the way it extended to everything she had built here. Bessie near the kitchen door watching Clara with the specific attention of someone who is determining something. My father did this, Clara said. Her voice was level. She had been practicing levelness for 22 years, and she drew on every year of it now. He could not get what he came here for 8 days ago, so he found another route. He has used the legal system as a tool for personal advantage before, and he is doing it now. She looked around the circle of faces. The witnesses are paid. The accusation is false. Ethan has not left this mountain in over a month, and there are 40 people on this property who can attest to that. The court date, Grady said. When the county court is closed until Monday, that's 5 days. 5 days, Ethan sitting in a county cell for 5 days on the basis of a bought accusation, while a judge who might or might not be independent of her father's remaining influence determined whether the case proceeded. I'm going to Redstone Creek, Clara said. Grady looked at her steadily. Miss Ashford. Clara, she said, just Clara, and I'm going. What I need to know is who is coming with me. Grady was quiet for exactly long enough to make his decision with the completeness it deserved. Then he said, I'll get the horses. Thomas uncrossed his arms. I'll get my tools, in case we need anything persuasive that isn't a weapon. Wren transferred Pearl to Bessie without a word and said, I know people in Redstone Creek, people who remember things. Cooper and Wilt materialized from near the far barn. 4 others stepped forward from the group in the quiet way of people who have been deciding and have decided. 8 of them in the end, 8 people who saddled horses in the sharp morning air and rode south off Storm Ridge into the country below, not because anyone had told them to, not because it was their obligation, but because Ethan Croft had built something on that mountain that they were willing to ride for. Clara rode at the front beside Grady, and she thought about her father's voice in the study the night the letter came. His certainty that once she was on the mountain, she was someone else's problem. His absolute conviction that he had solved something by sending her away. He had not solved anything. He had sent her somewhere that gave her the resources and the standing in the community to come back. They made the journey in 2 days, pushing hard camping light, arriving in Redstone Creek in the gray morning of the 30th day. The town looked smaller than Clara remembered. The streets that had seemed significant to her as a child, freighted with social meaning, the places where reputations were made and managed, looked now like what they were. Ordinary streets in an ordinary town where ordinary people were doing their best, and some of them were being done wrong by. The county courthouse was locked. A notice on the door confirmed that the court would not convene until Monday. 5 days was correct. Clara stood in front of the locked courthouse and looked at the building and thought about Ethan in a cell somewhere behind it and felt something that was not despair, because she had not traveled 2 days to feel despair on a courthouse step. We use the 5 days, she said to Grady, all of them. We find the witnesses. We find the people my father has been conducting business with and determine what they know. We find anyone who was on the road north on the 14th of October and can say where Ethan was and was not. She turned to Wren. You said you know people here. 3 families, Wren said. People who knew me before. They're not friendly with your father. Good. Start there. Clara looked at the group. Talk to everyone. Don't look for what confirms what we think. Look for what's true. The truth is on our side. We just need to find where it's been put. They dispersed into the town like water, finding its level, moving through the social geography of Redstone Creek, with the specific intelligence of people looking for what is real beneath what is presented. Thomas went to the hardware suppliers and the working men's establishments where tradespeople gathered. Grady went to the ranching operations outside of town, the people who had business relationships with Storm Ridge and therefore reasons to care about Ethan Croft's situation. Wren went to the families she knew. Clara went to the creditors. She went to the bank first, not to ask about her father's debts, which she already knew enough about, but to ask about the timeline. The 14th of October. What had been happening at the Ashford property on and around that date? The bank manager was a careful man who had been dealing with Harlan Ashford's declining financial situation for long enough to have his own feelings about it, and while he would not share private financial information, he was willing to confirm with the precision of a man who kept meticulous records that certain conversations had taken place in the week preceding the 14th that were relevant to the Ashford estate's insurance arrangements. That was enough to know where to look next. The insurance company's regional agent operated out of an office on the second floor of a building on Main Street. He was a small, precise man who was very reluctant to discuss anything and became somewhat less reluctant when Clara laid out in clear and specific terms what she believed had happened and what the legal consequences of knowingly facilitating fraud would be for someone in his position, which she had looked up in a legal primer she had borrowed from old Silas 3 years ago and never returned. He did not confirm everything, but he did not deny the parts that mattered, and he showed her briefly and with great apparent discomfort a document that told her what she needed to know about the timeline of certain policy adjustments at the Ashford property. The policy on the grain storage building had been increased significantly 4 days before the building burned. 4 days. Clara walked out of the insurance agent's office into the October afternoon and stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed the cold air and felt the shape of what had happened arrange itself with complete clarity in her mind. Her father had burned his own building. He had burned it for the insurance money which he needed to service debts that had become unserviceable. And then he had needed someone to blame for the fire, both to protect himself from questions about the timing and to punish the man who had refused to pay him, who had stood in his own compound and told him he had no power there. He had chosen Ethan, and he had bought 2 people to say they had seen him. It was not complicated. It was simply the logic of a man who had always solved problems by arranging for someone else to pay their costs extended to its most brutal application. Clara went looking for the witnesses. Wren had given her 2 names she had heard mention, people whose association with Alderman Tate suggested they might know something about the arrangement. One of them, a man named Corbin, who worked the livery on the edge of town, had the specific manner of someone carrying a decision they had not fully made peace with. Clara found him in the late afternoon of the second day in the establishment on 3rd Street, where working men went in the evenings, and she sat down across from him without preamble. He knew who she was. That was clear from the way his eyes moved when she sat down, the recognition and the complicated mixture of things that came with it. I know what you were paid to say, she said, and I know you know it isn't true, because Ethan Croft was on Storm Ridge for the entire month of October, and 40 people will say so under oath. And when they say it, the man who paid you will not be in a position to protect you from the consequences of what you said. Corbin looked at his glass. I got a family, he said. I got debts. I understand that, Clara said. I understand that a man with debts and a family is a person that someone like my father can find a use for. I understand that $150 is a significant sum and that the decision looked different at the time than it looks now. She leaned forward. But Ethan Croft is sitting in a county cell right now on the basis of your testimony. A man who has done nothing wrong, who has spent 17 years building something decent on that mountain, and who does not deserve to lose it because my father needed someone to burn. Corbin said nothing. If you go to the courthouse on Monday and tell the truth, Clara said, I will ensure that you are not pursued for the perjury. I have the standing to make that arrangement and the intent to follow through on it. If you do not go, then I will present every piece of evidence I have gathered in the last 3 days and let the court determine what it does with testimony from a paid witness in a case that also involves insurance fraud, and you will be standing in the path of that without any arrangement protecting you. She stood. Think about what matters more, she said, the money or the man sitting in that cell. Think about what kind of person you are. She paused. I think you already know. I think that's why you look like you did when I sat down. She walked out. The third day she spent finding the hardware merchant who had sold Harlan Ashford a quantity of lamp oil on the 10th of October, 4 days before the fire. The merchant's records were detailed and accurate because detailed and accurate records were how a hardware merchant stayed solvent in a territory where disputes over materials and quantities were common. He was willing to produce those records because Harlan Ashford had not paid his account in 4 months, and the merchant's goodwill toward him had expired entirely. The fourth day she spent with Grady, who had found 3 men from neighboring ranching operations who had been on the North Road during the week of the 14th and who had seen no one matching Ethan Croft's description traveling south, who had in fact received a supply delivery from Storm Ridge on the 16th, 2 days after the alleged night in Redstone Creek, a delivery that had been signed for and logged and that required Ethan's signature and presence at Storm Ridge to arrange. By the evening of the 4th day, Clara sat at the table in the house of one of Wren's acquaintances and laid out everything they had found. The insurance policy increased 4 days before the fire. The lamp oil purchased from the hardware merchant 4 days before the fire. The supplied delivery signed at Storm Ridge 2 days after the fire. The paid witness with a documented relationship to Alderman Tate. The complete absence of any evidence of Ethan Croft on the South Road at any point during the relevant period. It was not a complicated case. It was simply a complete one. Corbin was at the courthouse on Monday morning when it opened. He was there before Clara's group arrived, which she had not been certain would happen, and which, when she saw him standing on the steps in the early morning cold, told her something about what kind of person he actually was underneath the bad decision he had made for money. He asked to speak with the judge before proceedings began. Clara was not in the room for that conversation, but Grady was, because Grady had the kind of face and manner that made officials willing to accept his presence without requiring explanation. And he reported afterward that Corbin had been specific and complete, and that the judge's expression had moved through several stages before arriving at a controlled fury directed entirely at the parties who had arranged for him to preside over a manufactured case. The second witness, who Clara had not found and had not been certain she needed to, fail to appear. The proceedings lasted less than 2 hours. The hardware merchant's records were presented. The supply delivery log was presented. 3 witnesses from neighboring operations gave accounts of the North Road. Corbin's revised account was entered into the record. The insurance agent, who had apparently decided overnight that appearing voluntarily was preferable to appearing under compulsion provided documentation of the policy adjustment timeline. Clara stood at the front of the gallery and she did not look at her father, who was present with his attorney and who had the gray, compressed look of a man watching his last viable position collapse. She looked at the judge. She looked at the proceedings with the attention of someone who had spent her life believing that what was right should prevail and who was now watching it actually happen, which was a different and more complicated experience than she had expected. When the judge spoke, his voice had the weight of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in ambiguity. The charges against Ethan Croft were dismissed. The evidence presented raised serious questions about the origin of the fire and the nature of the testimony that had been offered in support of the original accusation. He directed that the matter be referred for further investigation. Harlan Ashford was detained in the courthouse as Clara walked out. She did not look at him as she passed. She had said what she needed to say to her father 8 days ago in the Storm Ridge compound, in front of everyone who mattered to her. There was nothing further that needed saying. She was done with the performance of that relationship, done with the maintenance of it, done with the careful management of her own feelings about it, that she had been practicing since she was old enough to understand that the way her family worked was not the only way things could work. She was done. The door of the courthouse opened, and Ethan Croft walked out into the October morning. He had 5 days of a county cell in his face, in his clothes, in the set of his shoulders, and he looked at the sky. First, the way a person looks at open air when they have been inside against their will, and then he looked at the small group of Storm Ridge people gathered at the foot of the courthouse steps, and then he looked at Clara. She was standing at the bottom of the steps. She had not slept properly in 5 days. She had ridden 2 days hard and spent 3 days navigating the social and legal geography of a town that was full of her father's arrangements and her own history, and she had the specific appearance of someone who has done something that took everything they had and has not yet had the opportunity to recover. He came down the steps. He stopped in front of her. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at her in the way he had from the beginning, the way that saw her completely without reducing her to any single part of what he saw. "I love you," he said. His voice was rough from 5 days of too little water and too little sleep, and the words came out with the specific quality of something that has been held for a long time and is finally being set down. Clara looked at him, at this man who had watched her from across the street and remembered, who had given her a month and a locked door and a knife with her initials in the leather, who had trusted her when she put her hand on his arm in the compound and told him not to give them a reason, with the specific completeness of someone who trusts without reservation. "I know," she said, and then, "I love you too. Don't make me say it again in a courthouse." He looked at her for one more moment, and then for the first time since she had met him, Ethan Croft laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of someone who has been very serious for a very long time and has found something genuine enough to be moved by. Grady was looking at the sky. Thomas was examining the construction of the courthouse steps with great attention. Wren was smiling at Pearl. They rode back to Storm Ridge the next morning. The journey north felt entirely different from the journey south. The same country, the same trail, the same October light going gold in the aspens, but the air had changed somehow, or she had changed, or the particular quality of what she was riding toward had changed, which amounted to the same thing. They arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. The compound came into view around the long bend of rock face, and Clara felt something happen in her chest that she recognized as the specific sensation of arriving somewhere you belong. Bessie was on the porch. She looked at Clara coming through the gate, and she looked at Ethan beside her, and she said nothing, which was Bessie's version of everything. That evening, Ethan came to find her where she was standing at the corral fence watching Juniper move in the last of the daylight. The gray mare came to the fence when Clara approached and put her nose over the rail in the way she'd been doing for 10 days now, with the ease of familiarity. "We should talk about the wedding," Ethan said. "We should," Clara agreed. "Soon." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket. He brought out a ring, small silver with a pale blue stone that caught what remained of the light. He held it between his fingers without theatrics, without orchestration, simply presenting it with the same directness he brought to everything. "This was my mother's," he said. "The only thing of hers I kept besides the mare." He paused. "I am not going to make a long speech. You know what I think of you. You have known since I told you in the barn with the knife in your hands. What I want to ask is simple." He held her gaze. "Will you marry me, Clara Ashford? Will you stay here and build this with me and let me spend whatever years I have left trying to be worthy of the fact that you came down off this mountain and went to war for me when I couldn't do it for myself? You would have found another way," she said. "Not as fast, not as well." He held out the ring. "Will you?" Clara looked at the ring. She looked at the man holding it. She thought about a girl standing in a small bedroom in the Ashford house, looking at her own reflection and trying to determine who was looking back. And she thought about the woman she was now, the woman who had ridden 2 days hard into the teeth of her own history and taken it apart piece by piece and come back whole. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, the stone blue as the Wyoming sky in winter. He held her hand for a moment after. Then he kissed her careful at first, the caution of a man who has wanted something for a long time and is still adjusting to its reality, and she put her free hand against his chest and felt his heart beating and kissed him back with the completeness of someone who has decided. When they walked back to the main house, Bessie was standing inside the window, and Grady was in the yard, and Wren was on the porch, and none of them had been watching. "We're getting married," Ethan said. The compound erupted. It was not a planned celebration. It assembled itself from the people of Storm Ridge, the way good things assembled themselves in communities that have been built right spontaneously and generously. Someone producing a fiddle and someone else clearing the tables in the main room, and Bessie appearing from the kitchen with food that should not have been ready as fast as it appeared, but was because Bessie had been ready for this for some time. Clara stood in the middle of it and felt a specific and unfamiliar sensation of being celebrated. Not observed, not assessed, not managed. Celebrated by people who had watched her arrive as a stranger a month ago and had let her show them who she was and had decided on the basis of that they were glad she was staying. Martha appeared at her elbow with a cup of something that smelled serious. "Welcome to the family," she said, clinking her cup against Clara's. "The real one." The wedding was planned for the following week. Nothing elaborate. Ethan made that clear, and Clara made it clearer because elaborate was the language of appearances, and they were both done with that. A ceremony in the compound, outdoors in the October light, with whoever wanted to be present, which turned out to be everyone. Bessie appeared in Clara's room 2 days before the ceremony, with something folded carefully in her arms. She laid it on the bed with the reverence of someone carrying something that has weight beyond its physical form. It was a dress, simple and cream-colored, worn soft with age, the kind of garment that had been made by someone who understood that usefulness and beauty were not opposites. Clara touched the fabric. "Ethan's mother," Bessie said. "I kept it. I don't know exactly why. Perhaps I thought there would be a day when the right person arrived to wear it." She looked at Clara with the direct assessment that Clara had learned was simply Bessie's version of warmth. I think she would have liked you. I think she would have liked knowing that someone who chose to be here was standing in her dress. Clara's throat was tight. How do you know I chose to be here? I came because my family sent me. You came because your family sent you, Bessie agreed. You stayed because you chose to. Those are different things. The first one anyone can manage. The second one is the only one that matters. On the morning of the wedding, the sky was cloudless and the air was sharp and clear, with the particular quality of late October in the mountains, the quality that says winter is coming and means it, but has not arrived yet, that holds the last of autumn in a brief, clean perfection. Clara dressed with the help of Wren and Martha and Pearl, who took the ceremony of it very seriously, and contributed by placing small wild grasses into Clara's braided hair with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old entrusted with something important. She looked in the mirror in her room and saw herself in the dress that had been a young woman's in Missouri before a marriage had taken her somewhere she had not chosen, and she thought about what it meant to wear something that carried someone else's history. She thought it meant that some things get a second chance at meaning what they should have meant the first time. She thought that the woman who had written her life in hidden journals for 20 years would have understood better than anyone what this morning meant. Grady walked her out. She had asked him because he was the person on Storm Ridge who had known her longest, which was still barely a month, but a month that contained more genuine knowing than 22 years of family. The compound had been transformed in the quiet, efficient way of a community that knows how to do things together. Tables had been moved. Someone had strung lanterns between the buildings, and though it was morning and the lanterns were not lit, they gave the space a particular quality of occasion. People were gathered in the loose, attentive arrangement of witnesses who want to see. At the end of the space, under an arch that Thomas had built from pine branches over 2 evenings, stood Ethan Croft in a clean shirt and his good coat, his hair actually combed, looking at her with an expression that she had no word for and did not need one. Grady squeezed her hand once when they reached the arch. Then he stepped back. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister who served the mountain circuit, a weathered man of perhaps 60 who had clearly presided over enough of these to know that the ceremony belonged to the people in it rather than to him. He kept it short and honest. Do you, Ethan Croft, take this woman as your wife, to stand beside her in good times and in hard times, to build a life with her on the basis of truth and work and whatever love you are able to sustain when everything else is difficult? I do, Ethan said. And do you, Clara Ashford, take this man as your husband, to stand beside him in good times and in hard times, to build a life with him on the basis of truth and work and whatever love you are able to sustain when everything else is difficult? Clara looked at Ethan, at this man who had watched her be exactly herself from a distance for 2.5 years and had seen it as something worth asking for. Who had given her a month and a choice and a knife with her initials and the kind of trust that does not require conditions to hold? I do, she said. They were married in the October light with 40 people and one 6-year-old who was taking the whole thing very seriously as witnesses. And the fiddle started before the minister had finished speaking, and the celebration that followed was the kind that happens when people who have built something real together have a reason to mark it. Harlan Ashford was held for formal investigation following the courthouse proceedings, the Ashford estate moving toward dissolution as the insurance fraud case developed, and the debts that had been quietly accumulating for years became matters of public record. The social position Harlan had spent decades constructing and maintaining came apart with the particular speed of things that were built on presentation rather than substance. In January, a letter came from Redstone Creek. Clara recognized the handwriting as Meredith's, the careful, controlled script of a woman who communicated through presentation even in correspondence. She read it alone in the main room by the fire, Ethan sitting at the table with the ranch accounts, giving her the space to receive whatever it contained. The letter said that Harlan had become ill in the Laramie facility where he was being held pending trial, that the doctor said his heart was failing, that he had been asking for Clara. She sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about the study and the laughter and the sound of glasses clinking in celebration of her departure. She thought about the specific expression on his face in the Storm Ridge compound when she told him she had heard every word. She thought about 22 years of being the problem in a house that had no space for the kind of person she was. She thought about a woman who had kept journals under floorboards for 20 years, writing the life she wanted in the dark where no one could diminish it. She thought about what it cost to carry things and what it cost to keep carrying them when you no longer needed to. "I'm going to go see him," she said. Ethan looked up from the accounts. "Not for him," she said, "for me. I need to close that door properly. I need to do it in person." He looked at her for a moment. Then he closed the ledger. "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I'll come." They rode south in January, cold the two of them, and the country was white and hard and beautiful in the specific way of things that make no accommodation for human comfort. They reached Laramie in 2 days. The facility where Harlan was being held had a medical wing, and it was there that Clara found her father. He was smaller than she remembered. Not in height exactly, but in some dimension that was not physical. The particular largeness that power and money and the performance of authority creates in a person had contracted. He was simply a man in a bed, gray and diminished, breathing in the shallow way of someone for whom breathing had become effortful. Ethan stayed in the corridor. Clara sat down in the chair beside the bed. Harlan's eyes opened. They were still sharp, which surprised her. The mind still present behind the failing body. "You came," he said. "I came." He looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. She had nothing to perform and nothing to hide, and she sat in the chair with her hands in her lap and looked back. "I was wrong about you," he said finally. The words came out slowly with the effort of someone saying something they have been preparing to say and are not sure they have the right to say. "I was wrong about what mattered, about what was worth protecting." He paused. "Your mother and I, we were protecting the idea of a family, the appearance of it. We forgot that the family was the people in it." Clara said nothing. "You were always the most real thing in that house," he said. "I didn't know what to do with that. Real things don't fit the picture you've decided to keep." She thought about what to say. She thought about the laughter in the study and the letter and the moment on the Storm Ridge porch when she had said, "I heard you." She thought about the journals under the floorboard. She thought about what it cost to carry things and what it cost not to put them down. "I forgive you," she said. His eyes moved. "Not because you've earned it," she said, "because I'm not going to carry it up that mountain with me. Because there is something being built at Storm Ridge that I intend to be part of, and I cannot build it properly if I am spending energy on this." She looked at him steadily. "I forgive you, Harlan, and I am done." She stood. She straightened her coat. She looked at her father one more time, at the man who had sent her away thinking he was solving a problem, at the man who had accidentally given her the best thing that had ever happened to her by trying to be rid of her. "Goodbye," she said. She walked out into the corridor where Ethan was waiting. He looked at her face and did not ask questions. He simply fell into step beside her as they walked toward the door, and the cold air and the horses and the long ride north back to the mountain. Harlan Ashford died in February. The news came in a letter from Meredith, brief and precise, conveying information without asking for anything. Clara read it by the fire and then folded it carefully and held it in her hands for a moment before setting it aside. She sat for a while watching the fire and felt the complicated weight of a grief that was not simple, not clean, not the grief of losing someone you had fully had, but the grief of losing the possibility of something that had never quite existed. She was not broken by it. She was solid in a way she had not been before she came to Storm Ridge, solid in the way of something that has been tested and has held and knows now what it is made of. The spring of 1883 came late to the mountains, which meant it arrived with a particular intensity. When it did come, everything deciding to be alive simultaneously, the snow retreating and the grass emerging and the horses restless with the energy of a winter endured and finished. On a morning in March, a horse appeared at the Storm Ridge gate, a single rider, one bag. Constance Ashford dismounted at the gate with the particular care of someone who has not ridden long distances often and whose body is expressing an opinion about it. She had the look of someone who had been someone else for a long time and was trying to determine who she actually was now that the role had been taken from her car. Clara met her at the gate. Constance looked at her at the work clothes and the braided hair and the knife at her belt. At the woman her sister had become, or perhaps had always been, and had finally been given room to be. "The engagement is over," Constance said, "after the business with Father William's family." She stopped. "There is nothing to go back to. The house is gone. Mother is in Cheyenne with the Hartley cousins." She held Clara's gaze with the steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is standing by it. "You said, when this was all happening, you said there was a place here if I wanted it." "I said it wasn't a place for people who wanted to be rescued," Clara said. "I said it was a place for people who wanted to work." "I know." Constance looked at the compound behind Clara, at the people moving through the morning with purpose and without performance. "I have never worked. I don't know how to do most things that are useful." A pause. "Teach me." Clara looked at her sister, at the woman who had arranged herself on a settee all her life and smiled appropriately and said the right things, and who was standing now at the gate of a mountain ranch in March cold, with one bag and the specific expression of someone who has decided to begin something they don't yet know how to do. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Bessie will put you to work immediately and she won't be gentle about it. The bread takes 4 attempts to get right, and she will tell you exactly what you are doing is wrong on each one. The horses need feeding before breakfast, and Thomas will critique your hammer grip the first time you touch anything in the smithy." Constance's mouth curved slightly. "That sounds—" She paused. "Real." "It is," Clara said. "That's the point." Constance walked through the gate. The spring morning of the 11th of April found Clara and Ethan on the overlook above the Storm Ridge compound, the place they had stood on the afternoon of her arrival, looking down at what he had built. The valley below was coming green again, the aspen groves in their new leaf, the creek running high with snowmelt, catching the morning light in moving pieces. Below them, the compound was alive with the morning work. Bessie's voice was audible from the kitchen, the particular register she used when directing operations that required precision. Thomas was already at the smithy, the sound of his hammer carrying clear in the morning air. Grady was organizing the morning's riding assignments at the horse corral. Wren was crossing the compound with Pearl. Beside her, Pearl's red hair bright in the morning light, Pearl talking with the concentrated energy of a 7-year-old who has a great many opinions about everything. At the edge of the kitchen garden, Constance was attempting to mend a section of fence with the careful, focused attention of someone learning a physical skill for the first time. She was not fast, she was not yet good, but she was not stopping. And that, Clara thought, was exactly how it had started for her too. Not with skill, with the decision to keep going. Ida Hartwell was hanging washing on the line outside her cabin. Her son Jacob, 7 months old now, and emphatically alive, propped in a basket nearby where he could see her and be seen. He was making the sounds of a baby with opinions, a continuous editorial on the morning, and Ida was answering him in the easy way of someone who has been given back something they almost lost and has not forgotten the weight of that gift. "We did it," Clara said. "We're just starting," Ethan said. She looked at him, at the man who had waited 2.5 years and offered a month and told the truth even when the truth was expensive, and stood in a courthouse corridor looking at her with 5 days of wrongful detention in his face, and said the thing he meant without preamble. "I know," she said. "That's what I like about it." He took her hand. They stood on the overlook in the April morning and looked at what they had built and what they were building and what they would go on building, all of it imperfect and real, and entirely theirs, chosen by both of them, with full knowledge of what the choosing meant. The mountain stood behind them, enormous and indifferent, impermanent. The valley opened before them, alive and complex and full of the specific, beautiful difficulty of things that matter. Clara Ashford, who had become Clara Croft in October light with 40 witnesses and a fiddle, stood on the mountain that had received her when no one else thought she was worth keeping, and felt for the first time in her life, and then every morning after it, exactly like herself. That was everything. That was more than enough.